advent of 1970s. So today's goal is to, I think, how we sort of how the IPE led to the mercantilist stage, so-called neo-mercantilist stage in the 1970s, early 1970s. Then neo-mercantilist IPE again move on to globalization, right? Again, globalization, a neoliberal stage. So today's goal is to look at the advent of neo-mercantilism, then how that led to neoliberal globalization. Okay, these two are major goals of today's class. Then some criticism of globalization, right? The basic approach of this textbook, although it is a textbook, it has its own flavor. This textbook, the author of this textbook has his own, attitude toward IPE issues. He is sort of basically critical about liberal and global perspectives. So neo-mercantilism, then globalization, then some criticism of globalization from mercantilist perspective. Now, the 70s, IP structure, the 70s. We talk a little bit about the IP, the 70s. The huge change, the biggest change in the 1970s, interdependence. Interdependence, right? Qualitatively different. The IPE 1970s, qualitatively different. Interdependent period. Okay, interdependent, the meaning of interdependent, I think the scholar who addressed this issue first was the famous Harvard professor, the two famous Harvard professors, Robert Cohen and Joseph Nye. They wrote a book on this, right? International relations are changing into the interdependent period, right? So he took a cue from their book, right? So 70s IP interdependence, right? The meaning of interdependence is not simply, every country is interrelated. The meaning of interdependence is that there is no separate foreign policy, economic, military issues. All these different issue areas are interdependent on each other, right? I think that must be a functioning, summary of what interdependence is. So foreign policy issues, economic issues, military issues, or even cultural issues, they are connected. So from now on, countries, when they consider military issues, they have to link it to other issue areas, cultural issues even, right, or economic issues. Although I think we should think whether this is only a characteristic of the 1970s alone, right? But the 70s, the big characteristic, from their perspective, was this interdependence. Now, it's kind of interesting if you read this chapter. The 70s, yes, in international relations, the decade of 70s, very important. It was a huge turning point. If you look back over the 1970s, what happened in the 1970s, there were so many changes, right? Qualitatively different from previous decades. Even though you don't use the term interdependence, there have been so many important events in the 1970s. This author, I think, picks one event right, as the most outstanding important event, which is OPEC, energy crisis. I think the author thinks that everything comes from this change, OPEC and energy crisis. Then that, I think, generated so-called neo-mercantilist trade policy. A little bit of overstatement, in my opinion. But he begins with OPEC, energy crisis. Energy crisis, there were two stages of energy crisis. First stage, 73. Second stage, 79. Right? There were two stages of energy crisis. In the first stage, according to him, oil prices, it's not about gas prices, it was about oil prices, right? Oil prices shot up 4 times, right? 4 times overnight in 1973, right? Then there was a long line of, people waiting, gas stations, right? Well, how do you make a link between this, energy crisis and neo-mercantilism? There must be some intervening, right? Some intervening variables, right? How do you jump from OPEC and energy crisis and neo-mercantilism? Can you make a link? How do you make a link? There's an OPEC energy crisis, then why countries become more mercantilist in terms of trade policy? How do you make a link? Can anyone make a link between energy crisis and neo-mercantilism? How do you make a link? How does he make a link? Can anyone answer this? How do you jump from oil prices spikes and neo-mercantilism? What is neo-mercantilism? What's the difference between mercantilism, neo-mercantilism? Neo-mercantilism, like neoliberalism, there's a liberalism, neoliberalism, right? Neo-mercantilism, much more nuanced, subtle. It's not obvious. Okay? Still protectionist. Okay, you want to see? There was an energy crisis. And the system, right, changes from bipolarity to multipolarity and interdependence. Soviet-American duel kind of changes after energy crisis. It's multipolar and interdependent. And emerging countries are raising their voice, including OPEC countries. That's what they mean, right? Including OPEC countries and other emerging countries raise their voice, right? So that system becomes a little bit multipolar rather than bipolar. Soviet, US, right? Bipolar, right? You have Saudi Arabia, right? And from power perspective, American power declines. Clearly, American power declines. Soviet power goes up. Powers of other emerging countries go up, right? So bipolar weakens, multipolar kind of sets in, and the entire system becomes much more interdependent. Economic issues, military issues mixed up, right? Security issues, everything mixed up. You cannot separate, right? The American economy is in a kind of crisis. The American economy is a kind of crisis, right? American economy financially unstable, kind of technically financial crisis. The dollar crashes, right? Dollar crashes. Global economy is in recessions. That's kind of feeling people had at that time, right? Soviet Union, very powerful. Soviet Union, right? Right. America weakens. That's the perception people had at that time. Then Joseph Nye, Cohen came out and defined the new international system as interdependent period. They didn't quite use multipolar yet, but interdependence, yes, they used that term, interdependent. And there's a shift from Keynesianism to, right, like a much more market type economic growth strategies. Don't forget, you see, I think the major change between post and pre-70 is that, I said the America weakens, but we should not forget about Japan and Germany. Japan and Germany at that point fully recovers from the war, right? Fully recovers and on a fast track economic growth track. Fast economic growth track, right? Then they challenge the US economy. Japan and Germany challenge the US economy. So competition, economic competition, speeds up among these advanced countries, right? Among advanced countries. So economic competition, trade competition speeds up, right? So America was having a little bit relaxed attitude towards Japan and Germany, right? Embedded liberalism before 70. The idea behind it was that America sort of relaxed toward Japan and Germany, opened up US market on a preferential basis, right? Then Japan and Germany, they had liberty to protect their market, right? But things began to change. Japan, Germany recovers. Then US, they no longer open their market freely, right? The US began to treat Japan and Germany as equals, right? And the US and many of its allies, including Germany and Japan, they push for more emphasis on free trade and cooperation. Right? More full-scale liberalism. And in the meantime, because of these challenges from Japan, Germany, and challenges from OPEC and emerging economies, and due to the legacy of embedded liberalism, US began to have problems. US debt, trade deficit, right? Budget deficit, trade deficit began to increase. American deficits began to increase. Let's define interdependence in the 70s a little bit. Like I said, interdependence or complex interdependence, according to Nye and Cohen, it's mainly about the issue linkage between military, economic, foreign policy. Right? This is the meaning of complex interdependence. according to Cohen and Joseph Nye. And under this system, under this complex interdependent system, past practice of protectionism and mercantilism no longer be accepted. Right? Traditional mercantilism and protectionism, less politically acceptable and useful. So that's why states turn to neo-mercantilism. Neo-mercantilism. It's more subtle and more adroitly designed policies. Covertly designed policy. And these were not, right, covered in many regulations. So it just passed. This neo-mercantilist policy just passed through many regulations. Let's look at what they are then, right? What are these then neo-mercantilist techniques? Look at neo-mercantilist policies. And examples of neo-mercantilist policies are government spending, and regulation of industries. The government steps in, right? The government doesn't leave it up to the market, right? The government steps in, regulate the industries, and spend budgets. The government spend budgets for particular purposes. Channel budgets to particular areas. Right? These are examples of neo-mercantilist. It's not about tariffs, right? Traditional protectionist measures like tariff, they don't use it, but instead they rather spend it or regulate the industry or control capital, right? Capital market management, right? Or banking regulation, like interest rates. Foreign exchange market, the government controls foreign exchange markets. R&D subsidies. Subsidies for R&D. And state-owned corporations, companies. Banking credits, sorry about this, banking. State-distributed banking credits. And export subsidies. Export subsidy. They don't levy taxes on imports, which is traditional type of protectionism, but they would rather support exporting companies, their own exporting companies, export subsidies. Good examples. I think this textbook takes the example of the US and EU, right? The government, the EU and America, they extend subsidies to farmers. These are examples of neo-mercantilism, right? US and the US and EU. And it's interesting, I mean, if you read this textbook, talk about in many places petroleum industries, resource industries as part of mercantilist policy. U.S. energy policy, good example of neo-mercantilism. American energy policy. America and many other governments, they care a lot about energy security. Right? They don't leave energy issues to the market. Supply, demand, no. The government directly controls energy issues. And strategic petroleum reserves is a good example of how America, right, controls the energy industry. SPR, right? SPR is a policy where the government makes sure that when oil supply disruptions breaks up, the government makes huge volumes of oil, right, ready for rainy days. That's SPR. 900 million barrels, which is the equivalent of how many days? 90 days of supply. And this is for American policy. And America also, through IEA, okay? Through IEA, America cooperates with other, friendly countries, okay, as oil consumers. So not only America, but also Korea, Japan, many European countries, as allies of the U.S., these countries should have SPR also. Korea has it. If you go down to Ulsan, we have huge oil tank, right? Underground oil reserves, which is equivalent of 60 days of Korean oil supply. So Korea and these IEA members, they have to, when America give orders, we have to give out these, right, reserves to the use America designated in emergency situation. So that goes against market principles, according to this author. This goes against market principles, SPR. The idea of IEA goes against the market idea. So it's a neo-mercantilist policy in his view. SPR and even IEA, neo-mercantilist policy. You're right, because particularly in the energy business, even oil business is not run by the market, right? So this is a really, really different issue, right? Oil market is not a 100% supply-demand market. And another example, NTB, another example of neo-mercantilist policy, NTB, non-tariff barriers. This is the difference between pre-70s, after 70s. Countries, after 70s, they resort more to this type of unseen, hidden protectionist measures, right? Non-tariff barriers. This is euphemism. Non-tariff barriers. Okay, then let's talk a little bit about how liberal ideas became more popular in the 1970s. Globalization campaign was launched, right? The 70s led to the 80s and 90s, right? Then increasingly liberal ideas, set in. finally it snowballed into the campaign for globalization. It seeks to build, right, this global idea, globalization campaign, seeks to build a uniform capitalist system where every economy looks alike, right? Every economy looks alike. The two governments or presidents were behind this globalization campaign. President Reagan and the British Margaret Thatcher in the early 80s. It requires a little bit of explanation of general international relations, right? The shift from the 70s to the 80s, right? And from President Carter to President Reagan, and the emergence of Prime Minister Thatcher in the UK in the early 80s. The general mood at that time. How old were you at that time in the early 80s? Were you born? No? You were not born. Wow. Okay. I'm old. And then did you read about this period, the 80s? No? What comes to your mind when you think of the 1980s? President Reagan is praised as the best, right, most populous president in U.S. history, almost U.S. history. Right? 70s, like I said, 70s, U.S. decline. Okay, the challenges of developing economies, Japan, Germany, right? The Soviet Union, the power of Soviet Union increased. Now the 80s, things have really changed, dramatically changed, right? America regained power. Okay, the U.S. emerged again. The Soviet Union collapsed. The Soviet Union collapsed, right? And America began to sort of retake the control over the world in the 80s, throughout the 1990s. And that coincided with the globalization stage. Right? The 80s, 90s globalization stage, the rise of the US, same. Right? Happened at the same time. Right? And liberal ideas, right, became popular, but the author says it was a combination. It was market-oriented policy, but at the same time, military and political power. Right? Reagan doctrine, it encouraged developing countries to adopt the economic liberal policies, right, of the IMF, World Bank, and GATT. And America win the Cold War, right? Was very confident about, right, U.S. power, U.S. ideas, right? Very confident, and push for sort of a unified global capitalist policy, using military power at the same time. And U.S. Europe, they began to argue that Japan is unfair in terms of doing trade with other countries. That's why the U.S. suffered deficits. So that has to be corrected. So they began to blame trade deficits on Japan. Trade conflicts between the U.S. Japan, right, raged in the 80s and 90s. So trade policy, U.S. trade policy becomes, right, very aggressive. They punish some countries, right, when they do not abide by liberal, regulations. They punish Japan, Brazil, when they dump their products. They have this kind of Super 301, right, the famous laws that bans unfair trade practice. They even threaten NATO allies, telling them don't import natural gas from the Soviet Union, right? So trade policy has become a very useful tool. In fact, you know what? This is actually the Soviet Union at that time. Right? The Soviet Union was the #1 supplier to the European countries, many European countries, gas supplier, which is still the case even today. But America wants to change it today, right? That is changing. European dependence on Russia, traditional dependence on Russia, is now about to change due to many different sources of supplies outside Russia today, including the U.S. So this is changing today. But at that time, it was a huge issue, European dependence on the Soviet Union for natural gas supply. Right? And America put more pressure on Japan, Brazil, South Korea, and many emerging economies to lower trade barriers and to decrease trade deficits. Now, then the globalization campaign, the globalization stage, we need to discuss a little bit. What are the main policy ideas behind globalization, which is casually called Washington Consensus? There is a set of 10 policy tools from American perspectives. Right? Economists sitting in Washington, they prescribed 10 essential policy tools for economic growth, for developing economies. Right? So this is a menu for choice for developing economies at that time. So the message for developing economies, if you want to develop as an economy, you need to have 10 essential policy implementations. Let's look at what are these 10. Basically, I think 10 policy Washington Consensus is an emphasis on, more than anything else, the importance of macroeconomic stability. Macroeconomic stability. This term appeared really a lot those times in the 1990s. Macroeconomic stability. Macroeconomic stability. So macroeconomic stability is key to economic growth in many developing economies. Macroeconomic stability is about budget and finance, right? So in their opinion, developing economies, they don't develop because they have macroeconomic instability. They have budget deficits, right? High inflation rates, right? These problems. And they have to be integrated into the international economy. Integrated. So what are these 10? First, fiscal discipline. Fiscal discipline. So many developing economies are fiscally undisciplined. Right? They spend too much. The government spends too much. Right? So that they have, most developing economies, they have budget deficits. So they have to grow again, they have to cut budget deficits. This is number one policy, which is called fiscal discipline. Second, public expenditure must be having priorities, right? They have to use public expenditure well, right? They have to prioritize public expenditures. So the message here is that many developing economies, they are big spenders. The failure of developing economies, they are big spenders, the governments, which is wrong. Tax reform. To grow again, you need to cut taxes. Number 3. And broaden the tax base. Right? Financial liberalization. Financial liberalization. Many developing economies, they have financially, right? Financially, they are closed. So they have to open up the financial market. Open up the financial market to foreign capital. This is number 4. Exchange rates. Exchange rates are also controlled by the government. Or sometimes currencies are not convertible. Right? So currencies should be convertible and exchange rate should be free. Number 5. And trade liberalized. Right? The more you trade, the higher the growth rate. Right. FDI, foreign direct investment. The more foreign direct investment, the higher economic growth rate. I think these two, I mean, everything is very controversial. Privatization. You need to privatize public companies. Right? Private CEOs doing much better job of running the company than government, right? CEOs. rather than public officials. Privatize. Privatize. Deregulation. Deregulation. With Korea, I think under the new president now, right? This is one of the top government agenda, deregulation. The Korean economy is still highly regulated. So the president is really pushing very hard for this term, deregulation. Probably the term our president, after she comes in, used most is probably this one, deregulation. Deregulation. So the idea behind this is that the cancel out those government, right, regulations, admin regulations. So that the idea is that new business can enter the market easily. That's the goal, right? So the entry of new firms, right? Make the entry of new firms easier. That's the goal, deregulation. Then your economies grow, right? Because competition is important. Competitive market is important. Then finally, IPR, intellectual property rights. And reduced role for the state. So this is, this comprises the menu for liberal policy, neoliberal policy, which is known casually as Washington Consensus. So this was presented to developing economies, right? In developing countries, they had to pick and choose from this. And you know, those changes developing countries underwent in the 1990s, even into the 2000s, right? Including Korea. Sometimes this policy was imposed, right? The way they impose this policy is that when developing economies are in economic crisis, they make these make like a financial help conditional on these policies, right? So that, including Korea, many developing countries had to adopt some of these neoliberal Washington Consensus policies. All of them are controversial. Exactly the opposite argument can be made. But this chapter follows with some of the criticisms of neoliberal policies. Let's get to that. Then the question is put like this. Then why LDCs, right? Why LDCs, they have to adopt neo-mercantilist policies, right? In other words, again, I mean, the question here is that, you know, how do we criticize Washington Consensus policies? Most advanced countries, most LDCs, they would rather have a more pragmatic a mixture of policies, right? Policy where market is combined with the state and society. Here, I'm talking about page 96. Page 96. The new subsection on the LDC mercantilist policies, page 96. You know, why LDCs, they have to adopt neo-mercantilist policies, and why Washington consensus, globalization, neoliberal policies were wrong. The reason is developing countries, they have been searching for a more pragmatic and a subtle mix of policies. Then they cite Cambridge University Professor Chang Ha-jun again. Okay, he's one of experts who explains well why developing countries adopt mercantilist policies. This is what Chang Ha-jun said. Okay, same argument we learned from Friedrich List and Alexander Hamilton. Developing countries, they need a temporary handicap, using different terms. Then there's the analogy to kicking away the ladder, right? That argument. Level playing field, those things. And developing countries, they were unfairly treated by developed countries in trade negotiations, right? And those neoliberal policies were imposed on developing economies, right? In the form of structural adjustment programs, SAP, structural adjustment programs. Also, those programs were not contributing to economic development of developing countries. So LDC growth rates declined rather than increased under globalization. This is a debatable argument. That goes directly against Washington consensus and structural adjustment programs. If you adopt 10 different policies, you grow, right? But you test it, you look at different data, but after you adopt these Washington consensus policies, growth rates decline. But this has to be further tested. You need to look at many different data to test this argument, right? In the globalization period, you have to look at the growth rates of many different developing economies first, right? And you have to really calculate it to argue this, right? This is the argument made by anti-globalization scholars, right? Development conditions and growth rates in many developing countries worsened after globalization. This is this is the argument. But the opposite argument also can be made. Like you know, this big argument this big criticism of globalization can be broken down into smaller ones, like FDI. Does FDI help developing countries to grow? Right? Or does free trade lead to economic growth? So these are smaller arguments. Or how about privatization? If you privatize the industries, then economic growth. So there are many smaller arguments, which have not been tested rigorously. Right? Even this big argument, very ambiguous. And also differs from country to country. Right? I don't know whether you can make this big umbrella type of argument, because different developing economies might be different. Right? Like Russia. Right? There are many different economies. Russian economy, African economies, right? Economies in the Asian region, Korea, Thailand, Malaysia. They have all different conditions. Turkey, right? So this is a very difficult task to draw general conclusion, right? The Russian economy, very interesting case. The Russian economy was a huge laboratory at the time, the 1990s. Was a huge laboratory for Western neoliberal policy. Out of these 10 policies, Russia was not the first country that Western economies tested this neoliberal policy, but very good territory for testing. Because Russian economy was so almost 100%, right, non-liberal economies, right? And there was a perfect condition for privatization because companies were really state companies. Korean companies, we have state companies, but not as much as Russian or Eastern European. Eastern Europeans are really state companies, right? Koreans are just a hybrid. So it was a perfect model for privatization, Russian companies. And fiscal discipline, I mean, I cannot see any other example of government really spending freely as much as Russian government. I mean, the Soviet government, right? Under the Soviet plan, right? The government, the money was meaningless, right? There was no such thing as currency in that Soviet economy. So even deficit, surplus, meaningless, right? So the government, their goal was to almost like ideal welfare, right, country, right, where government takes care of, right, citizens for the entire life, right? But at the end, when America and other Western economies apply Western conception of the economy, it was pried open, then the Soviet economy ended up with a huge deficit-ridden country, right? So the Soviet Union had to cut spending, which was so painful. So fiscal discipline, that's that. There was no such thing as banking, right? Or even interest rates, everything There was no trade. Right? So now the question, Russia did. I mean, Russia accepted all these proposals. They integrated Western policies, right? They learned about Western principles, economic principles. And throughout the 1990s, right? And the outcome of that for Russia, look at the Russian economy today, right? The outcome of it. It's not, you know, market economy, I mean, in a true sense of the term, the Russian economy. So, the point, I think, the way we have to conclude this chapter is that, you see, I mean, this chapter still criticizes neoliberal policies. Look at the last segments of this chapter. The way he ends this chapter is, I don't know how you read the final two sections. If you read final two sections, kind of arguments they are making is that every economy, including the US, EU, every economy, there are certain areas that inevitably involves the government role, right? I don't know what was the intention of these sections. Maybe they were trying to say that those neoliberals didn't understand the nature of the economies. By nature, these economies are essentially, I mean, government roles are essential. The examples are, particularly this area, industrial and infrastructure area, first. And second, resource policy. This textbook is very uniquely written. I mean, the logic of it as a textbook. You know, industrial policy, according to him, can never be liberalized. There is no free industrial policy, no liberal industrial policy. Industrial policy always involves government of some sort. I think that is the real argument he's making. Infrastructure, again, same thing. Infrastructure, essentially, right? Essentially, it's government work. The market cannot handle these infrastructural issues. And that is also every government on the earth. Every government does it. Right? Whether the US or European, advanced or poor, every government, infrastructure policy, every government does that. Industrial policy, every government controls that. Right? So how can neoliberal scholars argue, you know, telling the developing economies, when you plan for industrial policy, leave it up to competition, right? How can you make that argument? That's the message he's trying to give. So these two areas, industrial policy, infrastructural policy, and resource policy, are the areas of really government job, government business. But at the end, I mean, even if this is true, I don't know how this undermines liberal argument. I'm not sure about that. Right? Yeah, right. I mean, these areas might require government function, but that doesn't deny the market functions for other areas like banking, trade, right? Many more areas. So this is not a direct criticism of liberalism or globalization. So infrastructural and industrial policy, I mean, if you read the remaining 2 pages, it has arguments where every government, use some sort of industrial policy, right? Limiting shares, foreign shares in a company. No government on the earth opens up freely company shares to foreigners. No government does that, right? Somehow they make it difficult for foreigners, right, to buy real estate. This is common sense. And America and European countries did it. And the most controversial argument, what's the role of foreign direct investment, FDI? Again, the role of foreign direct investment, his argument is that liberal argument is wrong, right? Reality is different from globalization arguments or liberal argument, because if you look at particularly countries like Japan, Korea, Finland, those are the countries, Japan, Korea, Finland, those are 3 countries that enjoyed great economic success without FDI, right? So Korea, Japan, Finland, they didn't rely on FDI for economic miracles. Japan prohibited FDI, right, in industries. This is industrial policy. And there was a limit on foreign ownership at 50%. And instead, Japanese, they encourage companies to license technology rather than take over. So that the Japanese FDI portion lowest, 2.5%. US 13.5%, Germany 25%, France 33%. So FDI argument in Washington consensus, if you look at these, wrong, right? Wrong. That's the developmental state argument, okay? Korea, Japan, developmental state, right? Strong industrial policy. That's how they grew economically. That's developmental state. Who said that? Jang Ha-jun. Right? The scholar who argued this first was Jang Ha-jun, developmental state. And who is the scholar who sort of revisited this developmental state argument? Robert Wade. Robert Wade. So Jang Ha-jun, first scholar, okay, who raised this issue. Then Robert Wade, Governing the Market, his book, the title of his book, Governing the Market, he revisited these issues again. The importance of, industrial policy in the Asia Pacific countries particularly. So industrial policies had a decisive role in Asian countries, East Asian miracles. So who argued this? Robert Wade. Robert Wade argued this. His book, Governing the Market. He's a neo-mercantilist. the secret to them, the secret to miracles, East Asian miracles, high savings rate. We saved instead of foreign direct investment, right? That's what liberals wrong. We didn't use FDI, but we can use savings internally. That's how we grew. Infant industry protection, right? Infant industry protection. Public investment. Public investment. The government-led investment. This is interesting. Large conglomerates. Company system. Korea, particularly Korea. Korea and Japan. Taiwan is different. Large conglomerate. These countries copy East Asian miracles, but very limited success. They copy them. They copy East Asian countries, East Asian models, but limited success. Meaning, this is a lesson. This is a lesson for many developmental economists. Again, this will be very useful for future economists in studying, why some countries are doing better than others. In other words, the rules and theories alone, right, don't explain economic success, right? When Russia copied Western models, right, it was a limited success. When these Latin American countries copied East Asian model, limited success, right? Then these market principles, when they are exported, right, they work differently. Why? Because these markets are embedded in deep roots. So markets, they don't exist in isolation. Markets are mixed with the state, society, maybe culture, right? So when you test some models, right, these market principles alone don't work. That's the lesson. Now, even Americans heavily used public investment. And particularly this textbook emphasizes procurement policy. Procurement policy. Citing some scholars, I think this textbook, which is a good, inclusion in this textbook, one of the reasons why America became a strong, powerful economy is that America used well infrastructure and public investment policy, particularly procurement policy for some scholars. What I mean by this, India, China, also education R&D. Government procurement is very powerful neo-mercantilist tool. Procurement, in other words, U.S. defense policy, U.S. defense spending. There's a huge defense spending, but defense spending can be done through some companies, Boeing, right? Or in other areas, different companies like Lockheed Martin, Motorola, IBM, Microsoft. Okay, they are all long-term government contractors. So government spends through these companies, and they become national champions. Again, this goes against, this contradicts neoliberal policies, neoliberal ideas. Even America does that. When America does that, how America can tell the developing economies, right? Okay, now today done. Thursday, structural perspective.